Well, we're going to move to Genesis chapter 24. Now, this is a long passage. So Minister Joe and I discussed this. We're not going to, usually we read the passage and then discuss it, but we're going to leave it to you to read the passage because it's a repetitive passage for good reason. There are reasons for the repetitions, and we'll talk about, that's a feature of Hebrew writing. So we'll talk about that, but we're not going to read it. We're just going to comment on it. This begins, Minister Joe, with Abraham old. Seems like that's a theme, doesn't it to you?
Yeah.
He's old in every passage. Abraham was old when the story started.
Right. Yeah, he was pretty old. 75 when he left her. Is that what it was?
One of the churches I was ministering at, we had a gentleman who was in his mid-90s. And at that time, when I started at that church, I was in my just late 30s. And it dawned on me that he was old when I was born. Mm. And I said that to him. I said, you were old when I was born. And he said, thanks for reminding me of that. But I only knew him as old. He would have been old my entire life. And that's my feeling with Abraham. Abraham here was in his 70s when God called him from Haran to come to the land of Canaan. And now he's older. I mean, now he's in his hundreds.
Right. Yeah, most people in our day, 75 would not be traveling by camel all those ways from Ur.
Definitely not. And it's like he started his life in his 70s, right? Because he has these herds and they start to grow and he's running. He even goes to war.
Yeah.
But my point is to say in chapter 24, verse 1, now Abraham was old, well advanced in years. I feel like, yeah, I know. He was old before and he's older now.
How old are you?
Exactly.
Well advanced.
But the key of that passage is that the Lord had blessed him in all things, and meaning that the Lord was with him, that his plans went well. And then he calls his servant to send him on a journey to go find a wife for Isaac. And we talked about Isaac's age last week, right?
Yeah.
He's 37 years old at least. We could be a little off on the numbers because we don't know just how specific some of the dating we've been given is, but he's at least 37 years old. Mm-hmm. And Abraham is deciding, I need to get this kid married.
Yeah, let's get him married.
He doesn't want to marry anyone from the land that they're in, and that makes some sense to us, right?
Right.
So you had mentioned a few things that stood out to you here right at the beginning as he prepares his servant to go on this journey back to Haran, which is no short trip.
Right.
And we know who this is. It only says in the text that it's the oldest of his house, but we know that his servant who would be his inheritor is Eliezer. He's already said that earlier, so that's who we're dealing with, Eliezer. But for some reason at the beginning, he's not named.
Right. He's been with him for a long time.
Yeah. All the way.
Yeah.
If he hadn't had Isaac and Ishmael, this would have been his heir.
Right.
Yeah.
So Eliezer probably came with him from Ur.
Oh, yeah, I think so. He's at least from Haran, but yeah, most likely from Ur, I think. So he's been with him a long time. And you were interested in this vow.
Yeah, very, very peculiar. I remember having a conversation with someone who was reading through Genesis, and the comment was, "What is this this custom or this what is up with the servant putting his hand under the thigh of Abraham? What is it all about?" And I think even you and I talked about it one time before as well, because I wanted to see what your answer was. Curious what your answer was.
Yeah.
And it is an interesting way of swearing. I mean, in our culture today, a handshake, a verbal commitment, or a written contract, or a way to promise somebody, might be something, to give an oath. That here is very, very different than what we would consider. Maybe makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about it.
Yeah, it's a strange, if the most serious vow in our culture is they make you put your hand on a Bible.
Yeah.
Right? You do that. I solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. I love that you have to do that because the assumption is you're going to lie. So you better promise not to. The default position is lying. But yeah, it's a strange thing. And you and I were talking about this. The official historical line, if you're reading commentaries and things, they insist that this is a Middle Eastern custom, that it's not unusual, that this would have been practiced in most households. But I mentioned to you, Minister Joe, that one thing I notice in academia is that people are very certain about things that are not very certain.
Mhm.
And it's very hard to actually know the customs. You and I were just talking about this, right? How many different ways are there to make vows in our culture? Lots of different ways, right? I made a vow at my wedding that was solemnized in a very certain way. I made a vow when I took this pastorate that was solemnized in a different way. I was called as a juror once, and they made me make vows, but those were different than the other two.
Yeah.
So oftentimes in cultures, there are many ways to solemnize agreements. And so we don't have access to all the ways in any historical document that agreements would have been solemnized in the ancient world. So historians, archaeologists might have one or two examples of vow ceremonies, like maybe it's on it's on some sort of a carving, or maybe they find a piece of writing that details some sort of an agreement, or maybe they find treaties between Egypt and Assyria or the Hittites.
Yep.
And then they just assume this is the template. All vows are made this way, and they go forward with that. But the truth is, we don't know. We don't have access. The best we can say is some vows were done this way. And you can see that, we talked about this last week, that the Hittite treaties that we do have examples of are between kings and their subjects. And they're different than what Abraham and Abimelech did, or Abraham and the Hittites did. But you can see shades of it. Mm-hmm. So I think the best we can say is this is an unusual thing. There's a lot, when very serious vows are taken, there's a lot of intimacy involved. In my undergraduate degree, I think this is speculative. That's what all that setup was for. I don't think we can know for sure. But in my undergraduate degree, it was suggested that the location of this vow had to do with what was actually being asked. So Abraham is going to send his servant to find a wife for his offspring so that his line can continue. And so the place where he hasn't put his hand reveals the intimacy of the request he's making of him. So his hand is close to Abraham's loins because Abraham's future seed is dependent on the fulfillment of this vow. And if Eliezer was to fail in this task, it would be similar to castrating Abraham. So my undergraduate suggested that it's possible this is not a normal way to do a vow, but it is possibly Abraham trying to solemnize the agreement, making it very clear to Eliezer how vulnerable he is making himself to him. So that makes some sense to me, but I think that's speculative. Others, and I've read the commentaries, believe that this is not unusual, that this might be the way that vows are solemnized. My point is we don't know, but I find my undergraduate suggestion the most interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. I did not tell you what I was going to say when you asked me the question before we started recording, because I like, the response to be right here. So yeah. I'm not trying to be a trickster. I'm not Loki or anything. It's good to interact in real time. So I don't know. I didn't give you time to respond to that. So I don't expect you to have an opinion. I've thought about it for many years. I mean, when was that? When did I hear that in my undergrad? That would have been like 25 years ago, something like that. So.
Yeah, I think that the passage doesn't try to explain it, so it's not like we have to make it or try to explain it much either, other than to say that it does say put your hand under my thigh, and I will I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven. So that there's a commitment there. It doesn't explain the hand under the thigh kind of thing, but it does make sense to me that what you said. The specifics of it, there's no explanation in the text to say why that it was other than to say put your hand on your heart and hand in the Bible, or cut their hand and they're blood brothers. That's something we've seen in the movies or whatever. But we, or some type of way of swearing, but there's definitely a witness before God.
Yeah, and I think at least my undergraduate professor recognized something that's right here in the text, which is that the location of Eliezer's hand is very close to the mission he's being sent on, the idea of continuing Abraham's line. So
Right.
there may be something like that. It seems like a breach of decorum for us. I think this would be sexual harassment today. And but I don't think it's meant to be licentious. I think in this passage, it's really about the solemnity of the moment and how much trust Abraham is putting in Eliezer. And we should not forget that earlier in the story, we found out that Eliezer would have been the heir if Isaac had not been born.
Right.
So here we have Eliezer. There are a lot of ways if he was not an honest man, he could betray Abraham.
Right.
And really hurt his future descendants, especially if he was vindictive at all or frustrated that he had been replaced or whatever else. So Abraham is making it very clear how vulnerable he's making himself. And I think that I kind of agree with my undergrad that that's the point.
Mm-hmm.
But whether or not this is the way vows were done, I don't think we can say. All we can say is that's the way this vow was done.
Yeah. And my visualization is that it wasn't from the, this is just what I assume. It wasn't from the inside of the thigh. It was from the side. So I picture him lying down, well advanced in his age, in years, lying down, and this was a way of showing that and that's kind of where the center of your body weight is, kind of thing.
Yeah. So it does say under his thigh though.
Yeah.
So there is some sense of I agree with there's some sense of closeness to the loins.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But the importance there too is I don't know if it's appropriate to say that here, but it's central to your life. I mean,
there's a bunch of weird vow things that you'll find, like in the law of Moses. If a servant decides they want to stay in this house, they don't want to be released, because remember, there were no lifelong slaves in Israel. They were always for a period of time. So if you wanted to get out of that situation, you could. You just had to fulfill your term of service. But if you wanted to stay and you didn't want to leave, then you drive a tent peg through your ear, or an awl through your ear in the doorframe of a house. It's bizarre, right? Mm-hmm. And again, is that the way it was always done? I don't know. Like we don't have enough archaeological evidence. Like I'll just say it this way: nothing irritates me more than assuming that the one thing we found explains everything we don't know. Like that seems to me to go be run-of-the-mill biblical archaeology sometimes, and it really drives me crazy.
Well, it sounds a lot like the Jurassic Park, where you take the frog DNA and put it in everything else. Yeah. Kind of dangerous. You end up with some weird animals. Yeah,
that wouldn't work anyway, probably. But hey, now they're finding soft tissue in the bone marrow of dinosaur bones. Maybe we don't need the mosquitoes anymore. Bizarre. We won't get into that.
I hear it's tasty.
Do you? I don't want to know who you're talking to. So anyway, they make this very ornate and intimate vow, and Eliezer is going to really prove his quality, isn't he? I mean, he comes out of this story really shining, right? Because he goes out of his way. Not only, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, Minister Joe. You tell me what stands out. But Eliezer clearly is a follower of the same God as the God of Abraham. He's not just following Abraham, who's following God. I mean, he prays to this God. He believes, right?
Yeah. He almost has more faith than Abraham has.
Now, why would you say that? That's interesting observation.
Well, to travel all that way and find someone, and then the process of which I'm just saying, we don't see any of his faults. That's what I'm trying to say.
We don't, but I agree with you. Like, he really puts all of the decision making into God's hands. Abraham has not done that. I wondered if that's where you were heading. Abraham sometimes tries to figure out how he can help God along. You don't get that with Eliezer. But it might be that Abraham's a head of household, used to making decisions, and Eliezer is a servant, and he does what he's told. And he definitely comes before God in his prayer like a servant. Whereas Abraham doesn't always. You know, I mean, he eventually becomes a servant, but Eliezer is naturally a servant.
Yeah.
And his name, I love his name because he really lives into it in this story. So Eli is my God. Ezer is, it's not good for the man to be alone, so God made him an Ezer Kenegdo, sometimes translated helper for the woman, but maybe better strength or partner would be a better translation of that word. But he says, God is my Ezer. God is my helper. God is my strength. That's what his name means. And he lives into it, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he depends entirely on God to go before him.
Right. It's almost like that's his title.
Yeah.
Then,
Yeah, you wonder, was it really his name? Or after this, was it what he was called? Because remember, in the ancient, at least in the scriptures, people are not always named at birth. Sometimes they earn their names based on what they do. And we see that. Well, I remember looking at a historical documentary that suggested that King Saul's name might not have been Saul because it looks like he's called the Lion by some nations outside of Israel. If it's Saul we're talking about, and this particular archaeologist did believe we were talking about Saul. And so he's called the Lion. Some people think that's David, but this guy thought he's talking about Saul. But he's called Saul because the word Saul, the name Saul, means chosen one.
Okay.
So he probably got the name Saul when he was chosen.
Yeah, that's interesting too, with the New Testament Saul.
Yeah, because God chooses another Saul.
Chosen.
Also of the tribe of Benjamin, same tribe as King Saul, also in rebellion against God. But the second Saul, who we know better as Paul, was not deliberately rebelling against God. He was inadvertently rebelling against God because he didn't know Jesus was really the true Messiah.
Right.
First Saul deliberately rebelled against God. So they have a lot of commonalities and some differences. But yeah, and they're from the same tribe. Paul makes a big deal out of the fact that he's from the tribe of Benjamin, as was Saul. So there's definitely correlations there. But he's another example of someone who has a name that is significant. Peter too, right? Jesus renames him. His name was Simon. And then Jesus gave him the nickname in Aramaic, Cephas, which means stone or pebble. And that translates into Greek as Petros, as Peter, which is rock. So that wasn't Peter's name. And we see God doing the same thing with Abraham. His name was Abram, and he renamed him Abraham. Sarai renamed him Sarah. Same thing will happen with Jacob. Renames him Israel. So God does give names later, but so who knows when Eliezer got this name, but it's very appropriate.
Right.
And I just like that he's worshiping the God of Abraham. That's not always the case. Sometimes you live in somebody's house or you work with somebody and you kind of have to pretend that you're following this God because there's pressure, my boss is a Christian, so I better toe the line, or, my pastor loves this particular teacher, so we all pretend to love him, that kind of stuff. But Eliezer is a real deal. I mean, Abraham's nowhere around.
Yeah.
And Eliezer is praying to this God and depending on him.
Not only does he make a commitment to Abraham before God, but he also has the audacity to ask questions.
Yeah.
Which is vital. I think so many times people will say, yeah. And the next thing you know it, they're like doing their own thing.
Yeah. He's truly a good servant, right? Eliezer would be a great example. Because you're right. I love that you're pointing that out. Yeah, he asked very specific questions. What if this woman won't follow me? Do you want me to bring Isaac to her? And Abraham, no.
Why do you think he's so afraid? You think he'll want to stay there?
I mean, we don't know much what their life was like in the land of Canaan as opposed to what it was like in Haran. Like, we don't know the difference. But there's definitely a sense in Abraham that he might not want to come back. Right. So what was life in Haran? We don't know.
I tend to think it was probably better. It was a good situation.
Yeah, I have a feeling too.
It's like going to Thanksgiving and never want to come home.
Yeah.
Because the food's good. You don't have to do all the dishes. And
Yeah.
You know, maybe that's what he was afraid of.
Maybe.
Or
And
or he might end up like, down the road, Jacob, 7 years there.
right. Well,
14
Jacob's experience is a generation later, but at
Mhm.
that point, the family's very wealthy there and settled. Like they're not having to do this traveling thing that Abraham is doing. So they're very settled. And maybe that's true now too. Abraham knows what he left.
Yeah.
Yeah. My kids, I loved the town I grew up in, loved it, miss it regularly. And when my kids go back there, they see what I see. Like they love it there. My parents are there, that helps. But there's also, I like it. And so do they. They would go back there anytime. Abraham does not want to risk
Right.
that.
Well, not only going back, but wanting to stay is the big
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah. But it's interesting, right? The man says, well, what if I can't persuade her to come? Like he wants to know, what is Abraham going to do?
Right. Kidnapper.
Yeah. Do you want me to take her? Are you going to be upset? Like how far do I go here? And Abraham said, if she won't come back, I release you from the oath. That shows us something about Abraham too.
Yeah, that's kind of an amazing thing, because that would be an easy door hatch to get out of a commitment, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. And you can imagine if Abraham said, and you see this sometimes in places, in archaeology and even today, where the guy says, if you can't get it done, don't bother coming back.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And that's not Abraham. He realizes that there are limitations and he won't push Eliezer past the point of morality.
Seems like a huge amount of risk, though, that Abraham's allowing to happen, huh? It's either risk or trust.
Yeah.
Maybe both. Maybe a little bit of both, huh?
I want to see it as trust in Eliezer and in God,
Mhm.
but it's at the same time risk.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe the
Is
two
it-
almost always go together.
Because there's other people involved,
Yeah.
It,
There's a lot of questions in the air here. And Abraham, who knows? I don't know how he left, if it was on good terms or bad terms. But he's insistent. He doesn't want his son marrying anyone from this land right now.
right.
And that'll be, Isaac will feel the same way, well, at least Rebekah will, about Jacob.
Mhm.
Though a little different about Esau.
Right.
So the servant takes a whole lot. He takes a full caravan with him. This is a very big entourage. So he's leading a group, right? I mean, 10 camels, choice goods. And he sets out from Aram Naharaim to the city of Nahor. Now, you talk a little bit about what you're seeing here. I'll see if I can find this on the map. Those are not place names that I'm familiar with off the top of my head. So I'll have to see if I can find a map with them. But if you want to talk about the caravan and what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good children's program.
It is, not to plug ourselves, right?
Yeah. But these are took 10 of his master's camels and departed. So Abraham really set him up good. This is a
Yeah.
good traveling experience.
Yeah.
Spared no expense kind of thing. And it sounds like Abraham is really going to make this, let's say, easier than not for
Yeah.
Eleazar.
Right.
So that's a good thing. A lot of times, sometimes people, this is not like compared to the Egyptian experience where they had to make without straw. There was a provision, because I think it shows how serious too, and how well Abraham knows his relatives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because this stuff really kind of spoke for him when he
Right.
shows up.
It does. Yeah. Abraham's definitely kind of displaying his wealth.
I mean, it's not like they had any other proof than Eleazar's word that
Right.
this is what's going on.
And we're going to find out later in the story that he brings some wealth beyond just the camels in the entourage, right? He brings a dowry.
Yep.
Yeah. So I did a little looking here, and Aram Naharaim is another way of saying Mesopotamia, it looks like, which is the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So it's indicating that he's going back to the region he came from. And the city of Nahor is most likely Haran. But Nahor, remember, it was named Haran because Abraham's brother died there, and his name was Haran. But Nahor seems to be the leader of that city now.
Okay.
Or at least in that region. That's what it looks like. So that's a very quick research, but I think so.
So the map that you're talking about to me reminds me of some kind of art. They couldn't go right across because that's like the desert, right?
Right. They got to travel up through the ridge. So I can put this back on for us so we can see where he's traveling. But pretty much what we showed at the beginning is the nature of it. So this is the big picture. Israel's here. Haran is here, which seems to be correlated with Nahor. And then Babylon is down in this area, which is Ur is a little bit further south than Babylon. So this is the region of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but you can see Haran is way up in the north of it. So they're going to travel up through the ridge route in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Oops, I'm sorry. I hit one of those little buttons. So they're going to head up through this ridge route, which is through the hill country of Israel, and then head north.
Yeah.
And they're going to go quite a ways north. It's actually hard to find doing it this way, but they're going to go quite a bit north. And this is still all Mesopotamia.
Edessa, is that a capital city right above there?
Yeah, I don't know much.
Turkey?
Today we would be in,
Is that Turkey?
I think it's a little south of Turkey, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
Either way, it's a distance. And
he's going to go a long way. Yeah, he's going to go a long way. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of miles. I mean, just looking quickly, I think we're almost 800 miles.
That's crazy, huh?
So it's going to be a long trip. It's not going to be a simple one. And so he has to have all these provisions. And it's no wonder when the camels finally arrive, they're somewhat thirsty.
Oh, yeah. And those camels can go a long ways without water. That's pretty cool. But
I know. I used to think, I was raised as a kid, I don't know who told me this. Maybe I just imagined it, that they kept the water in the humps, but apparently that's not true. Those are fat reserves. But anyway, they can store a lot of water. A camel can go a long way, but they drink a lot.
Yeah.
And that's part of the miracle here.
Here they kind of spit too, but I don't know.
Yeah. So he finally gets there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he says this prayer that we've been talking about. And he doesn't pray to God directly. He prays to him in the name of Abraham, right? He calls him Lord, which is always interesting that the divine name is there. That's obviously added in later by Moses and later editors, because that name's not been revealed to Abraham. That's revealed to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. But it's here to remind us which God they're talking to, because God, again, Elohim or El, is the generic word for any deity in the ancient world. So you have to get specific, and he is being specific. What the text is trying to tell us is he is specifically directing this prayer to the God of Abraham, the God later revealed as Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
So he prays him, he prays to him, he says he wants success, and he asks him to show him. What does your translation say there in verse 12?
Verse 12, it says, beg your pardon, hold on. And he said, O Lord, God of Abraham, my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show me your steadfast love to my master Abraham.
Steadfast love. Are you getting to be a Hebrew scholar? What's the word?
Chesed.
Chesed. That's it right there. Chesed. So it's right there in the Hebrew. He says, show chesed to my master Abraham.
Yeah.
He doesn't say to me. He doesn't say to Isaac. It says to Abraham. Eliezer is aware of this relationship. And so he asked for some specific signs. Very specific, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, it's not going to be unlikely that he would find a woman drawing water at a well, right? Because that, in the ancient Near East, as far as we can tell, that's typically something women would do.
Yeah.
So the fact that going to a well would be a good place to find women is not unusual. I know it's like going to the watering hole, right? Or today people will say to the bar, or wherever people think. Maybe now it's online, right? So going to the well is the right place to go. That's not an unusual place to go. But he's going to ask for water. I still wonder to this day how many girls he asked water from, because we only have the story of Rebekah, because that's the one that worked.
Right.
But I just wonder how many times he said, "Could I have water?" And they were like, "No chance, old man." You know?
Who are you? Don't talk to strangers.
Yeah. Who are you? Leave us alone, man. What are all these camels?
Yeah,
But whoever the right one is, he's going to ask her for water to drink, and she's not only going to give him water to drink, but also offer to water his camels, which I'm told is a very, very long and laborious process. Especially, he's got 10 of them.
Right.
And then he says, if that happens, let her be the one. And then he'll know that God has shown chesed to Abraham by making his journey successful. So it's a very specific prayer.
Yeah, it is.
How do you feel about it? I mean, do you pray this way?
Not all the time. I know
but you
that
have, right? Occasionally we do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's kind of it's not one of those if then kind of things. It's one of those things of confirmation where you're saying, God, I really want to do this, and you have an idea. It's not like it's total mystery. And there's this idea that this is something that's probably not so foreign to him, sort of like the hand under the thigh kind of thing. Maybe this is something that he's experienced before. Maybe he saw this with Sarah and Abraham.
Maybe he did. Yeah, he certainly has the expectation that this God is going to interact with him in real time.
Yeah.
And that he's a responsive God. He has no, he's asking for very specific signs. This tells us what he believes about God. Because you couldn't ask these kind of signs of the false gods, because it wasn't going to happen. But he's already gotten out too, right? If this doesn't happen, I presume he's going to go home.
Right.
And tell Abraham he couldn't find anybody.
Right.
And of course he doesn't want to do that, so he's begging God to answer this prayer.
He also has the backup deal where if the one doesn't come with her, doesn't want to come, then he's released as well. So that's to be honest with you, that's a sweet spot to be in, because if it doesn't work, a lot of times people are off with your head kind of thing if you don't do what I tell you.
Yep. Yeah, like the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland, and the guys who were supposed to plant the red roses and they end up white.
Yeah. Off with his head.
But Abraham's not that kind of a leader, and you're right. His servant has a lot of grace here. Now I can hear somebody getting to verse 15 going, "What's Josh talking about that they might have asked many people?" Because doesn't the text say that as soon as he had finished speaking, Rebekah was there?
Yeah, I think he was speaking for a long time.
and I often say that there's often a foreshortening that goes on in these stories, because they're not going to give you every detail, especially the ones that don't matter. So this might be a figure of speech, but it could be that as soon as he finished that prayer, the girl arrived. That could be, and it certainly could read that way in one way, but it doesn't have to. That's what I was saying.
I kind of picture it being like the Ents, talking for a long time before it happens.
Yeah, nothing's worth saying that's not worth taking a long time to say. Yeah. And so it just turns out, though, that to this very well came a near relative. Now, it's interesting. There was no way for Eliezer to be able to identify a near relative, I would doubt. I mean, he had never met these people. So he needs a different kind of a sign. He needs this more objective way of determining whether this is the right person. But it turns out that this is the right person, and we know it before he does. Because before he ever sees his sign, we hear this is the right family. So it's interesting. Eliezer's in the story, but we as readers get the answer before him.
Right.
but he's got to wait for it, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how he knew she was a virgin. Maybe there's something in the dress. Maybe they dressed a certain way if they weren't married. Maybe she didn't. We have wedding rings. So, of course, that's no guarantee of virginity nowadays. But in his day, there must have been some external sign, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
That this woman was unattached. She wasn't married. In the ancient world, viewed promiscuity much more harshly than we do. So they would have been declaring their unattached status.
Yeah,
So,
I guess I kind of always just assumed it was by the way she dressed, and I think it doesn't say it in the text, but I think sometimes it would have been, not a very good conversational start. Are you a virgin?
Yeah. Well, in the ancient world, you don't have that many categories, even though probably people did things they weren't supposed to do. If it became publicly known, you only have like a few categories in the ancient world. You have engaged, you have single and unattached, you have engaged but not yet married, you have married, and then you have either a harlot, or someone about to be killed for adultery. Those you don't have many other. You might have temple prostitutes and things too, but you don't have a lot of categories.
Right.
Yeah.
You did mention widow, right? Did you say that?
You could have a widow. That's true. No, I didn't say that. But yes, that's definitely a possible category. But she's young and unattached, and he can tell that she is not married, and that's what it means when it says she's a virgin.
Right.
Yep. And so she fills her jar. And then he asked her the question he told the Lord he was going to. And she does exactly what he had asked. Now, this prompts a question that you and I discussed, I think, earlier this morning when we were preparing for this. Does she have free will? And I'm not expecting you to answer. This is just the way to start the conversation.
Yeah, I think she does. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been it. There's different ways that people look at free will. They would say, oh, she had the freedom not to go to the well. She had the freedom not to give him the water. She had the freedom not to water his camels. She could have just gave him the water, not the camels, and that wouldn't have fulfilled the whole promise or the whole prayer. So I guess in some ways, yeah, she has free will, but she has no idea of the consequences at this point.
Yeah.
Of what this is all doing.
Let me see if I can lay out the avenues of interpreting this, Minister Joe, and I'm going to give you a little quiz, and you see which one of these you like better, or maybe you can think of another way of reading it. But so to my thought process and study coming together, there have been various ways people deal with issues like this, where the Eliezer asks God to do something very specific, and a person comes in and ends up doing those very precise things. And one of the ways you could read it, like if you're really committed to free will and under the belief that God will never force someone into doing something they haven't chosen to do, like you might be under that perspective. If you're under that perspective, you could say that Eliezer is asking for a certain type of person, that he's looking for character qualities. And so he's not going to pursue anybody who doesn't show these character qualities of hospitality and graciousness and welcoming the stranger, things that matter to Abraham. So he's going to wait there till he finds this person. So we don't need, by that perspective, to argue that God's forcing Rebekah to do these things, because Eliezer is literally asking for someone who would naturally do these things. And so he's going to wait for this person. And it just so happens that Rebekah is the person who would do something like this.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, there's almost no providence involved. The challenge with reading it that way is that's very appealing to me. But the problem is, Eliezer specifically asked God to select the person. And so we're kind of primed by the text to expect God being behind this. Mm. So is he looking for a character, or is he looking for God to make a choice? I think the text suggests he's looking for God to make a choice, but I like the idea he's just looking for a certain type of person. So that's one way you could read it. You could also read this, if you're really committed to free will and God will never impose his will on anybody, not absolutely. They have to consent. You could also say that God somehow gave Eliezer a foresight of what Rebekah would do. And Eliezer is praying for something prompted by God. And it's simply predicting what Rebekah would do. That God placed this specific set of requirements in Eliezer's heart. And Eliezer asks for these specific things prompted by the Lord because the Lord can foresee what's going to happen. You might argue that, right? That's another possible way to read what's happening. A third way is that God actually causes Rebekah to respond to Eliezer in the way that she does in response to Eliezer's prayer. So that would be a more deterministic view. And the fourth way, we just go total determinism. God has caused Eliezer to pray in this way. He has caused Rebekah to respond in this way. And everything that's happening is ordered by the prior decree of God, and they only think they're free. So you have these four things. You might not remember them all, but that's about as good as I can do. I'm sure somebody could come up with another one, but I think those are the most obvious before us. Now, I don't know if you like one of those better than the other, or if you think of another way of interacting, but those are the four I choose from when I read this text. And I'll be happy to tell you what I think of those four, the more preferable to me. But based on the way you started this, I think you're not going to like mine.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. I don't really very much care for the God making all that happen. I think some people come to the text with that perspective. So we're working backwards here from number 4 to number 1. Like,
yeah.
And not too much in favor of God determining and making all that stuff happen. Just because of the idea of free will. And I'm not even sure that's why this passage is in text that agrees with that idea. Obviously, there's more to it than just what we read that in the text. I mean, there's a purpose of why this is in here, and I doubt it. I doubt it to show that God's making everybody do anything. We just don't see that in the other places. I mean, he calls Moses, or he calls Abraham. He doesn't necessarily doesn't present as he's making them do it. They have a choice.
Yeah.
A lot, and that kind of thing. So it's harder to believe that number 4 would be the purpose of the text.
Yeah.
But what I would favor more toward is, there's a desire from Eleazar to fulfill his role as a servant to Abraham, and in some ways that reflects the relationship of what God wants from us.
Yeah.
For us to honor him by serving and doing what he wishes. And so I see it in some ways that they both have free will, because Eleazar could have done anything he wanted to, and he had a way out.
Yeah.
He did too. And so I would probably err on the side of them both having free will, and that because of the situation, the specifics of Rebekah being the person to fulfill that isn't just chance. But I do like the idea of the type of character. I've told people there's not just one person that you should marry. It's a type of person that you should marry, and you should be obedient to that leading, to doing. You can pray to God, say, put the right person in my path, which I think Eleazar is asking.
Right.
But yet there may be 10 other women that would fit that description. So those who say that there's only one Rebekah, well, we know that there's probably thousands of Rebekahs on earth.
Yeah.
It's just being in the right place at the right time as well.
Yeah. Of course, she had to be from a specific family, so that limits your options.
Yeah, well, he didn't know that either then.
He
Other
didn't
than it
know, but
was,
that's who Abraham sent him to.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so there is maybe and I think I've given you the wrong answer. And I'm not even
No,
sure
this is something that requires a long answer.
yeah. I mean, I tend to believe that Eleazar probably had more of the inside scoop than is realized in this passage. Because if he came with Abraham from that area, he might have known more about the area and about the people, about where people were more inclined to habitat where they get their water from.
Yeah,
And
wells are so important in this area because of the aridness of it. He definitely knew the right well to come to.
right, so I mean, personally, I feel like it's just a weird thing carrying water. I mean, water's heavy. Can't understand how that would really work with women carrying water like that. But you know,
But that would be a normal thing in this
yeah,
culture.
yeah, which is kind of weird. I mean, water is almost 8.5 pounds per gallon.
Yeah.
Uh, so it might be a little bit less manageable. So
Yeah.
long story short is I believe that there is free will. I have a hard time believing that because the other scripture, other uh, scriptures that project that way. It's harder for me to believe that God just caused all this to happen.
Yeah.
No, I like the idea of the servant praying and asking God for favor and direction, those kinds of things. And I like the thought that maybe God was saying to Rebecca, "Hey, it's time to go water the animals or get the
Yeah.
water," and that this came this way. So I don't see God telling her to do that.
Yeah.
I think for me, I'm finding more that as God gives me impressions to do something, and I follow that avenue or that that branch or whatever, however you want to call it, that it's more of my obedience and listening to God than whether or not I've gone left or right,
Yeah.
following His impression. And so that I guess that's what I'm finding. I don't know if that's real helpful here or not.
No, I think talking this through like in real time is important for people because, the act of thinking something through is a very interior act. And it's not very helpful when people don't show their work. I was just doing a math assignment with my daughter before we started recording, and she got it sent back to her because she didn't show her work. So the teacher didn't know the process by which she went to find the answer. And they want that work shown. Most of the time, for some reason in Christianity, we just want the answer. We don't want the process by which you come to an answer, the way you talk yourself through the options. We just want to know what you think. And I like this format so much better because it's what I saw a debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson a year or two ago. And one of the things they said they liked was that this was like thinking in real time.
Mm.
And that's what we're doing. You have to process through this. And you might start in a direction and say, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this. But then you start thinking about it and you go, well, maybe it is a little bit more of this. And the key to this kind of conversation is to not get stuck in one track and refuse to change direction because you've committed yourself to it. Like you just kind of think your way through. And then you put your best foot forward. That's all we can do, our best guess. And none of us know how God is working behind the scenes. He doesn't tell us. So we're guessing. But I like the process of guessing. And I appreciate that you were willing to do your part in talking through it. If people don't have patience for that, you're never going to learn anything. Like you got to see how we work this through.
Yeah.
For me, you and I might be a little different on the free will. I find that I'm a little bit different on how I understand free will from a lot of people in the Wesleyan and Arminian persuasion, where if anybody doesn't know what those words mean, there are very few traditions in Christianity that actually argue for free will. The Roman Catholic Church certainly does. The Orthodox Church certainly does to a degree. But in the Protestant churches, you're stuck with Wesleyans and Arminians. Everybody else is a varied assortment of determinists. believing that ultimately God is the only one with true freedom. So, and even some of them don't think he's even free. He's bound by his nature. So, but I do have a bit of a distinctive, and I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that's what some determinists believe. So that, just to be clear. But for me, I might be a little bit of a hybrid. I suspect that Eliezer made these requests because of the character they would reveal. So I'm very comfortable with that's why he made the requests. But I think if God is going to answer this, he's going to have to influence Rebekah's response. Unless, like you said, I don't know how many daughters of marriageable age who were not already married lived in Nahor's household. There's certainly, I would say there are probably not thousands, but there may be more than one. But my sense is God's going to have to be part of making sure she responds in this way if he wants Eliezer's trip to be a success. And Eliezer seems to assume that God is going to be involved in this. That's what he's asking for. He's asking for God to be involved. So I would say at the very least, Eliezer expects God can influence people's decisions. But he's also, I think, asking for these things because they reveal character. So I think it would be very duplicitous if God pressured a selfish, horrible person to do these very selfless things. Like, I think that would be pretty deceptive. You know, like, oh boy, she looks really gracious. And then you find out she's a monster. Like, what a terrible way for that to go. So I'm guessing that Rebekah had to have some of this in her.
Yeah.
But her specific response, I think, is being dictated by God. I don't have difficulty with God doing that on occasions, as long as, I mean, God can do whatever he wants. But my sense is when God does this, it's never permanent and it's never meant to be deceptive. So, for instance, you didn't use this example. You used like Moses, who has a lot of free will, Abraham, who has a lot of free will, but you didn't use the example of Pharaoh. God said he was going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, he says that before anything ever happens. Now, once we get into the story, it's pretty clear that Pharaoh had a fairly hard heart to begin with. You know, it's not as though God picks somebody who is normally, a very amiable guy who's willing to give you whatever you want. And God says, I'm going to make him a mean, stingy miser. Like, that's not what happens. I mean, Pharaoh is generally hard-hearted towards the Israelites. We already know that. But God still insists he's not going to let them go until God finishes his sermon. So God, I think, is behind some of Pharaoh's refusal to let them go. Not all of it. Sometimes it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. Well, God doesn't have to intervene if that's the case. But there are other times where Pharaoh wants to let them go, and then he has a change of mind. And I think the text is meant to say God's behind the change of mind. He's not letting him let them go, even when he starts to want to. He's going to finish his sermon. I think it's the same thing with Rebekah. I expect she is a generous and hospitable person, but this is even beyond the hospitable. That's how, if Eliezer asked for a normal hospitality, there might have been a dozen people who responded. He wanted something unusual, and that's how he would know God was behind it.
Yeah.
So maybe she's generally a generous person and normally would have done a little extra, but God makes sure that she does everything Eliezer was asking her to do. I don't have a problem with God determining that myself. And I know some Wesleyans and Arminians, I've talked with some who believe that it's a violation of God's character ever to override a person's free will. I don't agree. I think he can override our free will anytime he wants to. I think it's his grace that he doesn't do that.
Yeah.
But I have no difficulty with him doing it. And I would say I've seen times where he does. Pharaoh, I would use Rebekah as an example. But again, he doesn't override our free will in a direction we're not already pointed. Pharaoh's already pointed to hardness. God is going to continue that. He's going to make sure that it carries through. I'm guessing Rebekah is already pointed towards generosity, but I think God is going to make sure that she continues in that direction so that she meets Eliezer's criteria. That's the way I kind of read it. And so it's kind of an interplay of the sovereignty of God and the free will of people and them coming together. I think it would be a violation of Rebekah as a person if God made her do something that she would never normally have done.
Yeah.
But I still have no problem with him behind the scenes making sure she does what she does.
Yeah, and I think
That's
it's
where I am.
probably more reflective in the rest of the story, where her parents say to her, "Are you willing to go with these guys? You're willing to
Yeah.
go with this guy? You don't even know him?" And she's like, I mean, if I were her dad, and my daughter come to me and says, "I just met this guy at 12, and we want to go, 800 miles away from home," I'd be like, "Nah, that ain't happening."
It's not going to happen.
It's not
Yeah.
happening.
Sometimes Nahor and his household, Bethuel, I guess, is specifically the son of Nahor that's in here. They get bad raps, right, for resisting.
Yeah.
But that's the right thing, right?
Yeah. Excuse me. Who are you again? I don't care how much money you got.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just sort of like selling your daughter. It's not.
Now, we don't know. I'm guessing that the nose ring, the bracelets for her arms, and the shekels, some of that might be engagement, like getting the engagement ring. And I don't know. You think the nose ring is an engagement ring? You think that's how they did it?
Yeah,
we don't have much about this history, so
I'm not thinking like the bull hook nose thing here. I'm thinking one of those things that go kind of in the side here, like that. That's what I'm thinking, like a sort of like an Oriental princess kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking like the bolt where they put the nose, a big honking thing in the nose of a cow, a bull or something to pull her along.
I don't know either. And I don't know if there's actually pierces or if it's just some sort of a clampy kind of thing. I'm going for clampy. But anyway, I'm wondering if it's like an engagement ring.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know if this is meant to say she's now engaged. Does she go home with the engagement ring on? That's what I'm asking you. What do you think?
I think that's what it looks like.
It looks that way to me too. And I'm,
is that like a retainer or something? Like, I'm making
it's definitely
my
a
offer.
dowry. So in these days, if a man wanted to marry a woman, he had to pay her father. And I know that that's very different than our culture. There is a sense in which women were treated as a type of possession in the ancient world, and we don't believe that anymore. I just did a wedding for a group from rural Africa, and they still do this. One of the things that they had to ask was whether the dowry had been paid, and the man had to affirm, the woman's father had to affirm that it had been paid, and he made no further claims. I didn't know anybody still did that.
Wow.
But it was like going back to this. So some of this is a dowry, I would think, some of the money. But I'm wondering if it also indicated engagement. But anyway, I'm just wondering what her parents thought. Like if she walked in with the engagement ring, that would have been a different feel than if she just walked in with a bunch of money, right?
Yeah. I think it was a sign of commitment. Like, hey, let's go talk to your parents, or the little a tag or sort of like sold or.
Yeah,
some
we
type
shouldn't
of
go
commitment.
there. That would be pretty offensive. But
Yes, it would. I think.
Taken.
Yeah, I don't think it's obviously she had to submit to that. I mean, I would think I could do wrestle to the ground and put a nose ring in her nose.
Yeah.
I don't. That's not the image I get.
And after she does all these things and receives the gifts and invites him and his camels in, he gives thanks to God for his chesed. These are two very, very critical theological terms. This is verse 27. Thanks God for his chesed to Abraham and his faithfulness, which is the word emet. Those words are theologically loaded. They are the two defining qualities of God throughout the scriptures, that he is chesed, he's steadfast in his love, he's loyal, and he's emet, he's faithful. He carries out what he says he's going to do. And both of those things, Eliezer gives thanks to God for. So he clearly sees God behind the choice of Rebekah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially by her response too. I mean, there's that aspect.
And then she runs home. And of course, the reason he gives God thanks is he finds out this girl's from the right family. I don't know what he would have done had she been from the wrong family.
Oops.
I know he's putting a lot of faith in God, a
Yeah.
lot of faith, and he really does. This is all faith. This guy's walking in the dark, man.
Yeah.
But
Right.
he believes. And so she runs home, and we meet Laban for the first time. He's going to figure in prominently into the Jacob story, but he's just a young man at this point. And so the guy apparently stays at the spring, the servant Eliezer, because Laban runs out to meet him. But here it is. As soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and when he had heard the words of his sister Rebekah, thus the man spoke to me. He went to the man, and there he was, standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside when I prepared the house and a place for camels?" It's interesting that Laban uses the word Yahweh, but we'll get into that because that's unexpected to me. I did not expect that. I never expected. Every time I read it, it stands out to me.
Yeah.
I didn't think anybody in Abram's household in Haran knew the God of Abraham. But Laban uses the special word that the text, the writer, Moses, and the later editors of Genesis intend us to know that he's talking about the God of Abraham.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. But anyway, notice how Laban pays special attention to the nose ring and the bracelets.
Oh, yeah.
I still think this is engagement stuff. But anyway, we're guessing. But yeah.
He says, "This is money. This is money. I know something. All the money."
But yes, I get it. And this guy wants to be really clear on why he's here.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that there is that desire for personal attention. He just drove his 800 miles to get a drink of water, and that they might see the gold, and they might just think he's the actual one that has got all this resource. And
yeah,
the temptation for Eleazar must have been huge to, you have another one here, do you have a sister, or
yeah. Yeah. And this might be the first they've heard of Abraham since he left, and we know it's been a long time.
Yeah.
We're talking 60 years.
Yeah,
So
it's a long time.
So it's a long time, and he wants to make sure it's very, very clear. It's probably a point of decorum at this time to always make your intentions known, or maybe it's just a bit of grace on Eliezer's part. But in either case, he doesn't want to eat until he's explained the reason for him being there. Now, I wonder how they responded to his story, because some of it Rebekah could confirm, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like she could easily say, "Yeah, it's true. He was there. He asked me if I would give him water, and I did."
Mm-hmm.
But there's a part that they couldn't confirm, that these are the specific signs he asked for. Mm-hmm. There's no way for them to know if that's true. He could totally doctor this to make it look like Rebekah's the one, right? So, but he wants them to know that the Lord is the one who sent him, and he gives them some information that we did not know. Did you see the new information?
Let me see here.
It's in verse 40.
Yeah. Here we go. Yeah, let me just read it, and that'll help us out, right? But he said to me, the Lord, before whom I walk, will send his angel with you and make your way successful. You shall get away from my son, from my kindred, from my father's house. So, yeah, I would say there's some divine influence there. Some.
Isn't that interesting?
Messengers.
Now, in the way of Hebrew storytelling, you might, in the way of English storytelling, like American and English, Western literature, you might think that Eliezer is sweetening the pot, that he's embellishing a bit to add to build his case. But in Hebrew storytelling, you'll see this throughout the scriptures. It's not unusual to hold back a detail until it will have the most impact. So you see this, for instance, right at the beginning of Genesis in the story of Adam and Eve. So Eve is having that long conversation with the serpent. And the whole time you might be thinking, where's Adam? And then at the end, after she eats of it, it says, and she gave some to her husband who was with her.
Right,
and you
there.
Go, what? He's been there the whole time? Like, why wasn't he saying anything? And you might say, oh no, he couldn't have been with her because we would have known. Well, that's because you're a Western European thinker. Like, we would always tell people. We always do the setting and the plot and the characters first, typically. But the Hebrew storytelling, they like the details to come when they're going to have the most impact. So finding out that Adam was there the whole time is strategically timed. And I think the same thing here. We didn't know that Abraham told him an angel was going to accompany him. And we find that out now. And so that's an interesting moment to be given that information. My point is, I don't think Eliezer is lying. I think this is a feature of Hebrew storytelling.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking, like, I've heard things people say about like when a king was coming into a town, they would send people ahead, say, prepare, get ready. I kind of thought of that kind of quickly when we were talking about this, but I didn't remember that as part of the story. So it got me.
It gets you. You go, wait a second. So an angel went before him and was doing stuff to prepare Rebekah for his coming, right? Like there's this idea of God making a way ahead of him. So it's very interesting that Abraham told him that would happen, but we didn't know Abraham said that. Everything else, right up to you'll be free from my oath when you come to my kindred, even if they won't give her to you, you'll be free. We did hear that. We just didn't hear the angel detail.
Right.
Yeah. And then he tells him, I came to the spring and I asked for this specific thing and your daughter did exactly that. And so now I know she's the one. I'm wondering, how do they respond to this? Because they cannot confirm he's telling them the truth. He could have said, I asked God specifically for her to be wearing a burlap sack and da-da-da-da-da-da. And look she's wearing exactly that. And she could say, yeah, I am wearing exactly that. But how do you confirm that that's what he actually prayed for? So they don't respond trusting him immediately. But that's the right response.
Yeah.
How do you know he's not lying? How will they know he's not lying? That's the question. And how are they going to be persuaded to trust this guy and his stories of angels and divine intervention? Anybody could come and sell that line to you and take your daughter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of, I think the moment is wondering, how is he going to persuade them?
Well, not my daughter. You going to take your daughter that way?
Yeah. No.
I don't care what kind of nose ring you put in her nose. That ain't happening.
I'm wondering, how do you read verse 50? Laban and Bethuel answered. So they're both here. The thing comes from the Lord. We can't speak to you anything bad or good. And they say, take Rebekah. He's given them very little choice, right?
Mm. Yeah, Eliezer is telling them, hey, this is what happened. This is a divine thing here.
Yeah. But don't you have a sense here that there's a little like, all right, you got us. I mean, we can't argue with God. I guess you have to take her. But I'm wondering if this is genuine.
Yeah.
I mean, I've said something to people and, they'll say something like, well, I mean, if that's from the Lord, who can argue? But they don't believe it is.
Right.
And so to know whether they believe him, you have to watch their following behavior. That's the point. Right? And whether this is an earnest, okay, this must be from the Lord. Go ahead. Whether that's earnest is going to be shown in the rest of the story.
Right.
And I suspect it's not earnest at this point because they're going to test it. As they should.
Yeah. Right.
I might have tested it more than they do.
Yeah.
So, but he takes their answer as genuine. And he's so happy, he thinks we did it. Yeah. Right? So, but then verse 55 gives away that it might not be everything Eliezer thinks.
Right.
Her brother and her mother said, let the girl remain with us a while. At least 10 days. After that, she may go. They're testing him.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But
how patient are you there, buddy?
Yeah.
She'll go on her own, man. She'll head on her own.
Yeah. And 10 days is not nearly enough time for them to go and find out if Abraham really sent him. Because that's what I would do. We're going to send one of our servants to Abraham. Where did you say it was?
Gotta check this
Let's make
out.
sure this is copacetic. But 10 days is not nearly enough time. So I don't know quite what their game is here, but they're trying to test something. right?
I think 10 days is probably more like their intention is more like 10 years, or 10 never is going to happen.
Laban plays this game later with Jacob, right? It's hard not to read it in.
Oh yeah. He's a scam man here, isn't he? He knows how to make it work.
Right. Now, the servant knows how long of a journey this has been already. He knows that Abraham's waiting for an answer. He knows Abraham is very old. So there's plenty of reason to believe that his urgency is legitimate, that he doesn't have 10 days to wait around. And he thought that they agreed with him. So he's wondering what this is. And he says, please don't delay me. So their next response is, well, we'll call her. We want to talk to her. We want to see if she trusts you. And they ask him if she'll go. And this is the key, right? I think God's behind this answer.
Yeah.
Because I find this to be the most unlikely answer I could imagine, unless she's just easily enamored with wealth. Why would she say yes?
Yeah.
This is the sign, in my view, that Eliezer never thought to ask for. He never thought to ask, will she be willing to go?
Well, he asked Abraham, but
he did.
He didn't
pray. He didn't pray that. And so she says she will. Yeah.
Well, that beckons that, you brought up that the angel head. So there may have been the side of the Rebekah story that we don't hear. Like, a guy's going to come here. He's going to ask you to give water these camels. He's going to give you these signs, the nose ring and these other things. Maybe that was more culturally acceptable or part of the cultural then, but it's sort of like, I think I bounce all the way to the New Testament, where you have, Mary, you're going to be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit, or Joseph, take Mary to be your wife.
This is a brilliant observation in my view, because you're right to point out with the story of Mary and Joseph. One gospel tells us Mary's side, the other Joseph's side. And there are two stories, but we don't get them at the same time. And that might be here. There is obviously the angel went ahead, and there's a story we don't have because the scriptures record Abraham's side of things. They don't record other people's side of things. We don't have Abimelech's story. We don't have Pharaoh's. We don't have Ishmael's story after Abraham puts him out. Like, we don't have any of those things. There's a lot of stories we don't have. And what we don't know is what the angel did. And that is really a brilliant observation, because for all we know, the way God got Rebekah to do these things is that the angel actually told her. Right?
Right.
Eliezer could have, we're just reconstructing, Eliezer could have said, Lord, please let her do these things. And then the angel could have easily said to Rebekah, you're going to meet a man and this is what you need to do. So he doesn't have to reach inside and just scramble her brain. It might have been a conversational maneuvering. We don't know. But the point is, they are way more responsive than reason would suggest they should be.
Yeah, right.
So something is going on here. God is in this. And there's a story we don't have. Maybe they prayed.
Right.
We don't know if they prayed. They clearly know who this God is. So Abraham, and that's not surprising either. I know this is a deep, deep dig, Minister Joe, but we were actually told that Abraham's father was part of the call to leave Ur and go to Haran by this God. So it's possible that Abraham knew of this God, even though he clearly doesn't know as much about him as he does later, in Haran, which might account for the fact that the whole family knows who this God is.
Right, and that's what I was saying about what I was gonna say. I don't think I did about Laban. You were like, where did he come up with this idea of responding that way? I think that there was either they're one side or the other. It's sort of like being called into the ministry. Yeah. You got some families over saying, you got to be crazy. What are you doing this for? And then another side of the family is saying, yeah, we affirm you. We believe you. We're going to pray for you. we're going to support you, but we ain't going with you.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And there may have been some of that for Abraham. It's like, no, we'll stay here. We'll keep the home fires going.
Yeah.
You go ahead and do what you're going to do, because we're settled.
Yeah. And we know that God first came to Abraham himself individually in Haran and asked him to go. So he must have shared it with his family.
Right.
So I love the idea that there may be a story we don't have, because we don't have the story told from this family's perspective. Maybe they prayed, that's why they let her go. Maybe she was prepared in advance and the angel came to her, much as the angel came to Hagar, right, in the wilderness, and told her to go back into Abraham's house because God was going to take care of her. It feels to me there's probably a story we don't have here, because they are very ready. But the story does tell us God's behind their readiness. It just doesn't tell us how he made them ready.
Right.
But they're clearly ready, because when Rebekah says she's willing to go, they release her. And then they bless her.
Are you surprised that they allow her to make that decision? Would you allow that? I mean, I don't know how old Rebekah really is.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. God is behind this, in my view, because I think this is unlikely. We see Laban later much more resistant to this than his father was.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he doesn't want to give Rachel to to Jacob. He wants to make sure that he gets every lick of work out of Jacob before he even allows him to walk away with one of his daughters, let alone two. So Laban is, maybe because of this instance, I don't know, he's much more resistant to respond in this way. And I find it surprising that even Bethuel was willing to respond in this way. You know, this is, and that Rebekah's willing to go. I see God's preparation all through this. And I like your idea that perhaps there's a story we don't have.
Yeah, I think there's more to it, and especially contingent on that verse that we pulled out before about the angel going before. Yeah. I think people really think about that, but that's still not determinism to me. That's a working.
Yeah, it's a different kind. It's a kind of a soft determinism when God makes sure you do what he wants by instructing you to do it and not giving you an option otherwise. That's a kind of a soft determinism, I suppose, but it's not a absolute determinism, because it doesn't take the free will away, but it makes it very hard to exercise it.
I mean, some of these things that we're talking about are, you wonder at times if it would be convincing for you.
If somebody came to my daughter at 17, 18 years old and told me this story, I know that I would not naturally believe it.
Right. You would want to see some more signs and wonders.
Yeah. I would want my own time to seek God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'd have a few fleeces of my own.
Well, we'll see in about 10 years, kid.
That's right.
10 days, 10 years.
This next verse 61, reminds me of a joke that a junior high Bible professor told me. And so this is a joke, but he said to us, "Did you know that there is actually a person who smoked in the Bible?" And we all said, "No." And he said, "Yeah." And the old King James said in verse 61, Rebekah lit her camel. But of course, now we're in the modern English, which says mounted the camels. Yeah. So anyway,
I don't know how did they get to that one.
I don't know. He had a whole bunch of those corny little pun jokes. His name was Mr. Wise. He was my first junior high Bible teacher when I switched to the Christian school in 7th grade. And I just loved that guy. I remember every one of his jokes, and they're not very good, but they still make me laugh.
Oh, with a name like that, you got to wonder if that was his real name.
Yeah. He loved those little things. We'll give away a few Genesis ones and early text. So he liked to say, who's the only man in the Bible who had no father? And of course, everybody says Adam. And he said, no, Adam's father was God. There's another guy who had no father. And Joshua, son of Nun, he liked that one. Yeah. And of course, the name's pronounced Noon, but I wouldn't tell him now.
Yeah, just
so he liked that one. And he liked the little riddle that the oldest man in the Bible died before his father. He liked that one too. And that, of course, is Methuselah is the oldest man in the Bible, but his dad was Enoch, who never died. So
He was wise.
he
Mr.
loved
Wise.
those jokes. Those are just three, but he had a lot of them. I think I have probably a dozen from him. But this was one. Rebecca lit her camel. Anyway, sorry. So anyway, for the kids out there, I don't even know if they have camels anymore, do they?
Oh, I'm sure they do. Those
Yeah.
were cool for a while, I think. You know, the unfiltered.
Joe Camel and everything.
Yeah.
But
I
she
guess
went,
anything.
and they don't send her alone. She also goes with nursemaids and things. And Isaac comes from Berlahairoi. You remember that? Do you remember that? Is that too deep a dig from the story of Hagar?
Did she name that place?
She named Berlahairoi when she was pregnant and chased out, and God came to her and showed her the well, and she named it the God who sees.
Yeah.
So Isaac is hanging around with Ishmael.
There you go.
Or at least in the region where his mother had named things in the Negev. And Isaac goes out in the evening in the field and he sees the camels coming. And Rebecca looks up, she sees Isaac, and she gets off of her camel. I think actually this is the verse where she lit her camel. I think lit means to get off in the Old English. So I might have been wrong. It might not be 61, it might be 64. It's one or the other. And
Either way, it's humorous.
Either way, it works. And said to the servant, "Who's the man over there?" And the servant knows it's Isaac. So she veils herself. That's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And the servant told Isaac all the things he had done. And it says, Isaac brought her into his mother's tent. He married her that night.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very interesting detail. And he loved her. So that word is not chesed. That is the word ahav. It's the same verb used in Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, when it says you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, all that. It means to prefer or to choose over.
Mm.
So Isaac didn't just receive her, he chose her.
Mm-hmm.
So he wasn't part of the process of her selection, but he agreed with it. And that's what ahav indicates.
Yeah, also she did too, though. Is that kind of reflective here too? Because she's like, "Who's that guy?" It's sort of like, I think I remember something like that. I walked into the youth building room and over and I said, "Who's that girl?"
Maybe, but as the story goes on, it does look to me like Isaac loves her more than she loves him. Just the way the later story goes.
Well, definitely with the identification with the kids. Sometimes kids can, I've seen when parents have sometimes a child will identify more with one parent than the other, and sometimes favoritism becomes division.
Yeah. And the division is started by God with a prophecy that Rebecca doesn't seem to tell Isaac about. We'll get into that story when we get there. But this brought comfort to Isaac after his mother's death. Right. And we had just covered that last week. So there's Isaac is approving of this choice. But they marry the night that they meet in the story. Now, again, that could be foreshortened as well. It's not unusual in Hebrew storytelling to really compress the story. Yeah. But the point that's being made is that he took to her immediately. He did not in any way have questions about her selection. If he had gone, that's, I think, the nature of the word ahav. If he had gone, he would have chosen her. So he's very, very approving. And it's good for him. Remember, Isaac hasn't really appeared since Moriah.
Right.
And his mother's just died. And we don't know what his relationship with his father's like after Mount Moriah, but they don't talk much.
Yeah, it almost gives you a sense that this is a rebirth for him.
Yeah.
In some ways.
And Abraham's not here to present her to him.
Right.
That's a very conspicuous absence. I think you and I have said that something happened on Moriah that affected Isaac and Abraham for that matter. And it seems I don't know. It plays out here. You would not expect the servant that Abraham sent to be the one to present her to him.
Yeah, you almost feels like Abram, the strain between Abram and Isaac was strong, but the comfort that Isaac felt was through the sheltering from Sarah. So I think there's a subliminal message here about maybe
Yeah.
Staying in his mother's tent.
I agree with you. And I think there's a sense here that Abraham knows that Isaac needs someone other than him. And he knows that he's got to get married. He's never going to survive without his mom.
Right.
And that rift appears on Moriah. Like that's in the story where it appears. I mean, up until then, Isaac and Abraham are interacting, but they don't interact again after that. So I think there's some signs that there are scars here.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
But Isaac wasn't the only one alone. The next chapter talks about another Abraham marrying another. So they're taking others. So.
Yeah, that's the strange part of this story, and we'll deal with it next week with the death of Abraham, which is very, very brief, and then talking about Ishmael. But not many that I talked to remember that Abraham got married afterwards, and then he has a lot of children afterwards. I mean, for someone who struggled his whole life to have one, he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with his wife Keturah. And we know nothing about her, where she's from or anything.
Yeah.
Like she almost seems like she's from Canaan.
Right.
So that's a bizarre addition to the story, but it ends with the insistence that Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac. So these other children were up a creek.
Yeah. Makes you wonder what that was, but yeah.
And she's called a concubine, and it's plural in verse 6. We don't want to get into that, right? It sounds almost like Abraham had multiple concubines. Maybe it just means this woman and Hagar. But it does say that every one of these children he sent away from Isaac.
Right.
It's a weird place. I don't think we should dive too deep into that. We'll deal with that next week.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think there's that definitely that resolution for Isaac in Rebekah. I think that's the point of this here. I mean, there's if we're to fast forward again with the Mary and Joseph thing, I would tend to think that we don't know much about Joseph after Jesus' birth, other than but
we know that he was faithful to the law because he brought Jesus to the temple for his circumcision and then again for his bar mitzvah. And Jesus carried on in his career as a carpenter, Mark tells us. So we know that he was the kind of father you would want to see, but we don't know very many personal details.
Yeah, I guess what I mean is the difficulty of their circumstances. I tend to feel like there's maybe somewhat of a parallel here where there was a resolution.
Yeah.
They were actually working together after the fact. I kind of feel like maybe that's what's going on with Isaac, is that he kind of lost his purpose after that incident.
Yeah.
And probably some people might have said maybe kind of a mama's boy.
Yeah, you might. And every time I read this story, the question kind of looms behind that I can't answer is why didn't she push Abraham to get him a wife sooner? And it's a very long trip, but Abraham sent his servant anyway. Why not do this before? And there might be a sense that Sarah herself was clinging to Isaac in a way, especially after what happened. I mean, that has ripple effects.
Yeah, well, she didn't have exactly, I imagine it wasn't exactly easy birth.
Yeah. Because she's 90 years old.
That age, and then to have the demands of a child, but not only that, by now he's 40 years old, so
right.
So it was like probably more along the lines that maybe Isaac was taking care of his mother.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it could be. So
Pretty neat.
lot of strange details that are, it's just fun to go through the text step by step like this, because it's just amazing what you uncover and what you see. And thank you for doing this with me. I think we learned a little something about God's providence. One thing we didn't talk about, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more next time, is about marriage and the reality. But I'll say this just really briefly and then leave you any final comments. One thing I'd want to say is that this story exposes how different marriage is in the ancient Near East than it is for us, because we tend to root marriage on passion. You fall in love, and that's when you get married. But the more ancient Near Eastern perspective, and one that you see throughout the Hebrew Bible, is that love follows marriage. It does not precede it. And so you see the text is very careful that Isaac loves Rebekah after they're married, but not before. And that's very typical. Marvin Wilson, in his book, Our Father Abraham, Jewish Roots of the Christian Faith, he uses, I can't remember who he's quoting. It might be Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's a Jewish writer, but I can't say that for sure. But he tells a proverb where he says the difference between the West and the East when it comes to love is that the West puts a boiling pot on a cold surface and it slowly cools down. But the East puts a cool pot on a hot surface and it slowly comes to boiling. Mm-hmm. And he argues that that is the difference. So these are often arranged marriages, or like this one, they had never met until they married. But the belief of the Bible is that love can grow after marriage. And one of the things that gets us into trouble, and I'm not saying we should go back to that, but there's something about it that's wise. And we tend to want passion to lead, and that gets kids into a lot of trouble.
Right. Because
where passion leads, the loins lead.
Mm-hmm.
And many kids get too deep into a commitment before they're really ready, or before they know anything about the person. The Eastern, at least in the ancient past, I'm not saying it's this way anymore, but the Eastern perspective was that you need to first make a good match before you let the passions go. That is so foreign to us, because we think marriage is built on passion. We think marriage is built on attraction. Matter of fact, I've counseled people who wanted to get divorced simply because they didn't feel as attracted to each other as they used to. It's a very interesting idea of what marriage is about. But you'll notice in the story here, and in many of the stories in the Bible, marriage is based on a covenant first. And then love follows afterwards if you're a good person. Or it never comes if the relationship isn't good. You think of like David and Michal, for instance. They have an arranged marriage. David is given her as a wife, and she loves him at first. But then he has to run from Saul, and Saul wants to punish David, so he gives Michal to another guy who loves her fiercely, and she gets addicted to that. And then when David finally comes back, he wants his wife back, so she's forced to divorce that guy, and then she hates him for the rest of their lives. You know, you know, it's very complicated, but you know, so not all of the relationships that begin with a covenant produce love. But the Eastern perspective is that you would never found a relationship on passion. And some people might say, well, wait a second, what about Song of Songs? Because that's very passionate. But you will notice in Song of Songs, if you listen to it, that the passion is both celebrated and warned against. And the phrase in Song of Songs that warns you against rooting your relationship in passion and following it is beware the foxes in the vineyard. Do not arouse or awaken love before it so desires. That is a repeated phrase in Song of Songs. Every time they start to follow their passions, you get a warning from the chorus. Do not arouse or awaken love before it so desires. That's the Easterners saying, this is a powerful emotion, but you shouldn't let it lead you.
Yep.
You know, so anyway, I wanted to make mention of that. And I just want to say that in this story, it's very well demarcated. The most important thing was that they go to the right family. So how a person is raised
Mhm.
is important. They go to the right family, they pray and make sure God makes the selection, and the covenant is based on something more than feelings.
Yeah.
Like we could learn, I'm not saying we should go to arranged marriages or anything, but there are some principles there that we would do well to listen to. That's my
Yeah.
point. But anyway, what are your final, those are my final words. I just wanted to have that, and we could talk about that, or you might have something else.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some things we can learn here about marriage. I mean, our culture is obsessed with instant gratification, all these kinds of things that lead to impulse or self um, you know, being driven by what you feel right now, and that those are the way people make decisions, and it affects all kinds of things. It affects relationships. It affects
And we
you know,
think of love as a type of eroticism, a type
right,
of sensual desire.
right,
We often conflate the two where the scriptures don't.
right, and then obviously some people identify their themselves by the way they feel, whether it be, I feel like I should be a man or a woman, or and that's their driving force, no matter even at the expense of denying what they physically look like. So,
Notice how different the sensibilities are. And I don't want to sanctify a culture, but there's something interesting about the fact that she puts her veil on to ensure that he will not be able to see her before they get married, which means
yeah,
he never saw her until
right,
after the marriage. Now that's the opposite. I mean, it seems to me in the West, people don't even want to marry a person unless they've seen everything.
right,
It's this entirely different thing. Like, but the sensibilities are so different, and part of that is cultural. But there's something we could use to think about, because in the New Testament, Paul insists that the decisions we make should be based on a person's character and not based on their affectations, the other things that we see about them. And so he
right,
encourages godly women to not put too much emphasis on the outside, because it will cause people to make judgments based on very superficial things. Instead, we should be looking at our character.
right,
There's a little bit of that here that carries into the New Testament that makes me think we should be paying attention.
right, right. And I agree with you on that. There's too many people basing their decisions, even in marriages, the decisions that people make. Well, this is how I feel, and I'm not moving or changing on it. Instead of listening to the heart of the person, asking the right questions for why do you feel this way? How did you get this place? Is this something you experienced in your past, or this is how your family made decisions?
Yeah.
Uh, those type of things. I think probably our culture would have a hard time having arranged marriages. I'm talking about American culture. I'm not talking about other places
Yeah.
where it's probably more acceptable. I mean, we made the diamond ring famous for wedding, and
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably was worth 50 cents until it came into America.
Yeah.
Diamonds.
It still might be better than the nose ring. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more attractive. Especially if you sneeze or something, that's kind of nasty.
Yeah.
But there's people doing it today with the nose piercings, so I think that's probably just as gross.
Yeah. I just
Um,
thinking that, I don't know if I would have wanted to propose with a needle. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I hear you.
It's a little easier to slip the ring on. But yeah, I think I wouldn't say that we go, I'm not even suggesting that we go to arranged marriages, but I still think there's a principle there. I wish young people, and I think it's part of us as parents to encourage our young people to understand what makes for a good match, and how easy it is to follow your loins and your passions, but how dangerous it is to do that. And what makes a good match, you do need to know the other person's family. You need to know the values. And I counsel with people constantly. And anyone who does counseling knows that the biggest conflicts that come into an early marriage is conflicts between the way one family did things and the way another family does things. And that shows up over holidays. It shows up over child rearing. It shows up over all kinds of places you might not expect. Like we joke about how you squeeze a toothpaste bottle or whether you leave the seat up or down. But there are rituals in families that are really, really different, and it needs to be explored. People, and I made this mistake as a young person because I'm very American. I didn't think it mattered the family my wife came from. Like, I thought that was ridiculous. And yet, thankfully, there was a traditionalist in me that I knew I should not propose to her until I had met her family and until I asked her father. Mm-hmm. And so I did wait for that. But in my own heart, I was like, I don't care what he says. You know what I mean? That's the feeling that you have at 20 years old.
Yeah.
You know,
I'm in love and ain't nobody going to tell me different.
Exactly. But I was kind of taught that love leads the way. Not that my parents ever told me that, but everything in the soup I was swimming in told me that. And so it'd be useful for people to realize that the family matters, that the upbringing matters, that God's approval matters, and that the covenant matters more than the emotions. I think that's important to mention.
Yeah, I think that in our culture we don't make enough time to proceed those kinds of things, to like, I mean, to spend enough time with somebody. Like, I have 3 kids. If I had to spend time with everyone that I thought was a potential candidate for marriage for my kids, and thoroughly vet their family, and know that, you know, that's not really practical in some ways.
Yeah.
To really understand, but some of it is we're trusting their own judgment that we've invested in them, the ability to discern the right person. I mean, my cousins, both of them are divorced. And
there is no right person, but there's always a right covenant.
Right.
You know, so, you know, one of the 2 families even today is often in the position of Bethuel, right? Where they're being asked to put a lot more trust in the other family. I mean, Abraham sent his servant. They had a long history, a lot of prayers. The servant is certain. Abraham is certain. Isaac is certain. Rebekah's family is being asked to take much more faith, unless there's a story we haven't heard. And that happens in our world too. Like in my own case, Jen and I went to school near my family and far from hers. So we came home and my family knew her. And my family approved of her before her family had even met me. And I went out and spent 1 week, spring break week, with her family. And that's all the opportunity they had to decide whether I could marry their daughter. Wow. My family had a year. But it's often that way because proximity dictates availability and accessibility. So it's often that way. And so I think this story also speaks to that dynamic. One family has to almost entirely take it on faith. The other family can have more confidence. But if the families know each other and trust each other, that will increase their trust. Probably one thing we never do is that the 2 families should probably be talking in the background. Like, it probably would have helped Jen's parents to have known my parents, because my parents knew Jen better.
Yeah.
But we don't think about that stuff. It's very self-centered.
Right.
And for that reason, there's a high divorce rate. I think it's directly correlated because we do such little poor preparation to get people ready to be married and to make proper selections that we're just kind of rolling the dice.
Yeah.
Most of us just roll the dice and we hope we know what we get.
Right. Yeah. I often say that people spend a lot of time in their marriage or after their marriage is trying to work things out because they never really took the time in the front load. So when people are denying or they're wanting to have premarital counseling, or, you know, at least I forget that there was a movie called If, I think it's called. This minister, they call it testing or something like that for people who are going to become married. And I thought that was such a weird name to call it, but in truth, there needs to be some proofing of some simple questions that can be asked to see if people are compatible. I think eHarmony and all these other dating match.com and all that, they have these thousands of points of compatibility. There's got to be some truth to that.
Yeah, there's in the scriptures, it has to do with a person's history and everything. I mean, one thing, if young people could learn anything, it's that your hormones and your desires are very poor indicators of the right course. whether we're talking about drugs and alcohol, or whether we're talking about careers, or whether we're talking about impulsiveness and the way we interact with people, driving, getting married. You do not want to just follow your native desires. They're very, very low resolution.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're looking for very particular things. By looking at someone, you can tell if they're genetically compatible and if they are biologically appealing. You can tell those things right away, but that is a terrible gauge of lifelong success.
Right.
Terrible, because character is what you have to live with.
Yeah. And if you're Phil Robertson, it's if you can cook.
Yeah. You see these, those kind of things. Anybody can learn to cook, but not anyone can learn to be good. Like a person has to develop loyalty and faithfulness. Skills can be taught, and beauty fades.
Right.
But a steadfast character, someone who's on your side and will support you through difficult times, someone who you will support, someone who responds well to your service and who will and who you don't mind being served by. Like that you can't pick that out because somebody has blue or green or brown eyes.
Right.
Or because they are a certain height, or because they have certain measurements, or because they laugh at your jokes. Like those are just the worst reasons to marry somebody. And yet so many marriages are rooted in that soil. I like at least the fact that the Bible is honest, that it's a complicated and difficult process to find a marriage partner. And it takes some deliberateness, and I, young people will never choose that on their own. That would have to be enculturated and as part of the expectation. And, society just doesn't want anything to do with that. Seems like society treats people like they're just candy. You just eat them up, and when you're done, you throw the wrapper out and you move on to the next thing. And if that's the way you're going to live your life, then what we're doing makes sense. But if you really believe in chesed and faithfulness and long-term commitment that lasts a lifetime, we should probably be thinking in other ways.
Yeah. As quick as this chapter goes, in reading it, there is quite a bit of time. So if the messenger went 800 miles before, there was some time spent. So there was some prep and some work.
And the angel went ahead of him and obviously did some work of his own.
Yeah, right. Right.
And I don't want to build it up too much. Like you have to find the one person, like you said at the beginning, that's very dangerous. But you do want to know the kind of person that a lifelong commitment can be made with.
Right.
And that might not be obvious just by your initial attraction, your initial spark, or the things you see at a first impression. That might not be obvious. So it takes some time. And getting over some of your hangups,
Yeah. Maybe that's why it took so long for Isaac to be in a position to get married.
He obviously didn't find anybody that he wanted to be with for the long haul in Canaan. Yeah. And Abraham thought, well, it's time for us to find a family that's more like ours. And that's not a racist thing or anything else. It's a culture thing. And you can marry someone from a totally different cultural background in terms of their family life, but you should, because there are ethical values in every culture, but you want to make sure at least your ethics are shared, even if the specific ways they're acted out are different. If you have a foundation, and I think that's why the New Testament will always encourage us to marry another believer, and that's way more important than culture.
Right.
And I think essentially that's what Abraham was doing. Let's go to a family more like ours, at least one who knows the God we know.
Right.
And that's wise. Jacob does the same thing.
Because these people in Canaan don't.
Any final words, Minister Joe?
Well, don't get married on the spur of the moment. Make sure you're praying about these connections. That's what I would say. That maybe the process in this text isn't exactly the way. It's not a model or some formula for finding a mate, but it would be good to pray about it and to take the time. Some people have said that if you start off slow, that things can develop at a better rate than whether you try to make things happen too fast. I would say this, that I know that there are lots of people who make decisions out of desperation, because we know from past passages that's not a good idea either. So don't rush your relationships, is what I'm trying to say. If we could make a summary of that, and know that if you're seeking God will work that, will honor that, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with you. This is not a formula, but it is a set of principles. The family matters. The character of the person matters, right? Rebekah declares her character as a hospitable, caregiving person who goes beyond what's expected. That's invaluable.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, she doesn't get to evaluate Isaac the way Isaac gets to evaluate her. And in our culture, thank the Lord, both husband and wife get to evaluate each other's character. In the past, that was the woman was less able to do that. But the evaluation of character is essential. And then the covenant being more important than the passion. That's important too.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us. And we'll be back next week talking about a little bit of Abraham, and we lose Abraham and we get some talk about Ishmael, but the real heart of the next story is the birth of Jacob and Esau. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
See you next time.
Blessings.